Good morning and good evening to everyone. Welcome to the second day of the virtual workshop on linking tsunamis with the people and the sustainable development with the support of CMP Commission in Goa. Today we have 4 speakers. The first speaker is PD Dr. Michaela Spiske, followed by Professor James Goff, then Dr. Dura, and finally Professor Anja Sheffers. It's my great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Michaela Spiske from the University of Basel, Switzerland. She's interested in short-term and long-term geological process, sediment-climate interactions, storm deposits and their intensities, hydrodynamics and inverse modeling. She has published high-impacted work in peer-reviewed journals like Science Review, Marine Geology, Sedimentology, and Sedimentary Geology. She has received a Young Researcher Award and an Outstanding Female Scientist Award for Mentoring and Marine and Coastal Research Award. And she has handled more than 15 projects of international funding bodies. And now I request Professor Michaela Spiske proceed with the presentation on tsunami deposits, what they can tell us about inundation parameters and recurrence intervals. Please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see the presentation right now. Yeah. Yeah, we had a great day yesterday, and I think we're going to have a great day today. Thank you for having me here, and also thank you for the organization of this event. As you can see from the title, my talk actually has 2 parts. First part will be about preservation potential and recurrence intervals. And we already talked about this topic a little bit, at least yesterday, because there was the question, how complete are the archives? And I think it was Luis who asked for how long are the boulders preserved in the landscape. So I'm not going to give any definitive answers, but at least I can show you some ideas on that. And then the second part kind of refers to something Pedro said during his first talk yesterday. Pedro said the identification of tsunami deposits in the record is not longer enough. We have to reconstruct the events in greatest detail. And so this brings me to the inundation parameters, which we can indeed also reconstruct for prehistoric or historical events using the sedimentary structures, but also using numerical modeling. All right, so I'm going to start with the normal approaches we use in tsunami sedimentology. And the first approach we use are the post-event surveys. So many of us go into the field just after an event. We study the inundation parameters. So hopefully we find evidence how far the water reached inland and maybe how about the flow depths. And then we look at the fresh, hopefully still unmodified deposits, and we learn how these deposits look like, and in the best we can kind of use the deposits and directly have evidence of flow parameters during the deposition of those deposits. And the knowledge we gain from the post-event surveys is then used in event stratigraphy. We go to regions like you have seen in the talks yesterday that were affected by tsunamis in the recent past. And we hope to find older tsunami deposits to kind of get an idea how often tsunamis happen in this region. I followed these 2 approaches for several years, and at one point I realized there is something missing, like the missing link in between those 2 approaches. And these are actually resurveys, and a resurvey or resurveys are surveys we conduct in, well, let's say 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and so on after the event. So we compare the fresh deposits of the post-tsunami surveys during the years to see how the deposits change through time, because it's actually not the fresh deposits that are preserved in the geological record, but it's deposits that are somehow modified. And we have to understand what processes modify the deposits and to which extent the preserved deposits are actually modified. So here's an example from Chile. The fresh deposit in 2010 is about 10 centimeters thick. It's overlying a loamy soil, and there's a very sharp contact. The same site, just 2 or 3 meters away from this location, 3 years later, looks like that. So this is the remains of the 2010 tsunami deposit, and you can see the thickness is less than half. It's between 4 to 5 centimeters. The distinct lower erosive contact is gone, and this is because of the bioturbation, both by organisms living in the soil and the sediment, and by the vegetation that developed on top by the roots that mix the sediments. So the resurveys help us to get an idea to which extent the deposits change through time, and if they are preserved at all. Maybe the surface processes are so intense that we lose the entire deposit. And this brings me to what you see here. The archives we're looking at are probably incomplete. So we lose evidence of tsunami deposits. And then if we want to calculate recurrence intervals, of course, these recurrence intervals are not correct because not all events are preserved in a record. And this is something we have to keep in mind. Okay, just playing around with some numbers. These is a list of notable tsunami events from 2000 to 2018. 18 years, and it's 20 major tsunami events. You can see there are some locations that even had more than one tsunami in this time. So looking at the number of tsunami deposits and then extrapolating the number into the geological record would mean that the geological record is actually full of tsunami deposits. But this is not the case, as we all know. So the questions we have to ask are we not able to identify the deposits? And I think after nearly 20 years of intense tsunami sedimentology and research, we are, I think, able to detect most of the tsunami deposits. So this is not the main factor. I think the main factor why the record is not full of tsunami deposits is actually because they are not preserved. Just another 2 photos for an impression about the preservation potential. So this is now arid climate region in comparison to the Chile tsunami deposits I've shown before. And here on the left, this is a coastal plain with rip-up clasts after this 2001 Camaná tsunami in Peru. The same coastal plain 6 years later, you can still see some of the rip-up clasts, but in comparison, it's less rip-up clasts, and the rip-up clasts are much smaller. The reason for this is in the dry climate, these loamy clasts dry and they disintegrate, they crack into smaller clasts, and so clasts get smaller through time. Tiny clasts might disappear, and in addition, the wind on this coastal plain blows away the fine sediment. So here are some factors we have that influence the preservation potential. Surface runoff in humid or moderate climate regions, surface erosion by wind, The bioturbation I have just shown in the Chile tsunami example, and the drying and the disintegration of clasts, like here, the rip-up clasts. And all those processes modify the grain size of the deposits and the thickness. And in the second part, when we speak about the inverse modeling, these are crucial parameters because these are the main input parameters for the inverse models. Okay, Luis asked yesterday about the preservation of the boulders, and this is a really surprising example from Chile. To the left, it's a big boulder that was transported onshore by the 2010 tsunami. This boulder comes from the intertidal zone. You see some larger boulders still in this zone here. And the boulder was transported onshore by the tsunami. The evidence that it was once in the intertidal is this white cover here. These are marine algae. It's a mud-rich siltstone, and the lithology of the boulders actually plays a large role if they are preserved or if they kind of disintegrate through time. And just 2 years later, we went back to the same location, and the boulder, as you can see here, disintegrated, it cracked, and now it's several smaller boulders. And just imagine going back 10 years from now, we wouldn't even be able to tell that these clasts are actually pieces of a larger boulder because the surface of these clasts will be smoothened, and so we can't really put them back together. So again, the grain size is actually modified because we think, okay, these are all smaller boulders transported by the tsunami. And then looking at the evidence, the marine algae on the surface, nearly the entire boulder is covered by the algae in 2010. And 2 years later, there are only very tiny parts of the boulders that still have the algae on the surface. So as the boulder dried, also the algae dried and they peeled off. And now the information that this boulder was once in the intertidal zone is lost. And so maybe we will not be able to tell anymore that these boulders, smaller boulders, were once transported by a tsunami. So we will maybe even misinterpret the deposit. So speaking about the recurrence intervals, this means that not all tsunami deposits are well thick enough to be preserved in the geological record, because we have to well, assume that the surface processes for the fine-grained deposits will remove portions of the deposits and maybe even erode the entire tsunami unit. And another aspect is important. There needs to be a certain time between the single tsunami events to be able to provide enough material for the new tsunami deposits. And this is, I think, a big topic, most of all in coral reef settings, where the tsunami rips off organisms and corals from the reef, because the reef needs years, maybe even decades to recover. And if you have a tsunami, let's say 2 years after the other tsunami, there was no time for the corals to recover, and therefore there's no material available for the next tsunami to transport. And so there will be no no new tsunami deposit. And of course, tsunamis are erosive events. They erode part of the underlying substrate. And so it can be that a larger tsunami event erodes the evidence of older tsunami events. So this means that the geological archives are actually incomplete, which I think is not surprising. But if you look at the recurrence intervals, what we get is actually a maximum time span between two events. And maybe other smaller events happened between two larger events, but we don't have any deposits of them because they were eroded, or because there was not really a lot of material available to create another tsunami deposit. Okay, and the second part is about what the tsunami deposits can tell us about the flow parameters. For recent events, flow parameters are well known. We have video footage, eyewitnesses reports that tell about the number of waves. We can watch the videos and see the flow direction. We have information about the inundation distance and probably also the flow speed, and we can calculate or measure the flow depths. And like in this photo here, this is again Chile 2020. You see a trim line below all vegetation, all soil was eroded, and this gives us a minimum height of the water, which is about 25 meters here, and above the soil and the vegetation were not eroded. And here this is grass and plastic bags in structures, and they also give us an idea about the minimum flow depths. Here in brackets is the sediment transport mode. The sediment transport mode is nothing we can really see, but we can use the sedimentary structures to refer to the transport mode, which means either transport as bed load or transport as a suspension. Another example from Chile. Here we found evidence of at least 3 waves. You see the debris line, for example, here, and this is the debris line at the maximum run up. You see all those tree trunks and plastic bags and stuff washed up until this limit. This is actually the maximum run up, and here the photo is just from up here. Looking over the coastal plain. There is hardly any vegetation left on the coastal plain, and you see the salt-burned vegetation here. This means this was inundated by the salt water. And then here above the maximum run-up, the vegetation is not salt-burned and is still green. So what we found here is evidence debris lines of 3 waves, but of course this is only the minimum number of waves, because the wave with the maximum run-up here will have eroded all evidence in form of debris line of earlier waves. So this is the first, I might say, preserved debris line, and then 2 debris line from later waves that didn't wash that far inland. The sedimentary structures that give evidence of flow direction are, for example, current ripples. The current ripples are asymmetric. They are steeper in flow direction, and so it's easy to tell what the flow direction is here. And current ripples and cross stratification can also be preserved in historic or prehistoric tsunami deposits. So we can tell, for example, whether it was a run-up or a backwash deposit. And it's not only the sedimentary structures, but also erosional structures that give evidence of a flow direction. Like here, it's an erosional scour around a boulder. The boulder is an obstacle, and the flow has to separate to flow around this obstacle. And again, the erosional scours are asymmetric. They are steeper here against the flow direction, and so we can tell the flow direction was this way. And it's the same if we find erosional structures in the geological record at the base of a tsunami unit, we may be able to tell what the flow direction was. So this is one method to use the sediments to get an idea about the flow parameters. If we are lucky, and this is obviously not very often the case, we can find evidence of several waves of the same tsunami event. Here's an example. You see 3 units, and the topmost unit still has the flow ripples, the current ripples preserved, showing its inland, a run-up direction. And looking closely on the deposits, these 3 units look pretty much the same. So this seems to be 3 run-up units. Here's another example. You see in a lighter gray color, this is the beach sand. And then here it's a sharp erosional base. On top, it's a heavy mineral-rich unit. So this seems to be the first run-up unit. And then the second is full of shells. Of course, a marine source of the material. And then on top, we have a concrete boulder sitting. And this concrete boulder comes from a road about 20 to 30 meters to the right. So the backwash was pretty strong and transported the concrete boulder onto the beach. But this also means, because of the strong backwash current, that parts or an unknown part or portion of the run-up deposits of the fine-grained sediments were eroded by the backwash. We don't know how much sediment we lost during the backwash, but even this sequence doesn't seem to be complete. Yeah, so next is numerical modeling. There are 2 types. It's inverse modeling and forward modeling. And the inverse modeling uses the parameters of the deposits, both the sand and the boulders, to reconstruct the inundation parameters of the tsunami. Tsunami magnitude in this case refers to the inundation parameters. And so we can reconstruct historic or prehistoric tsunami, which is, of course, important for the long-term risk assessment. With that, we can not only get information how often a tsunami happens in a certain region, but we can also tell if it was a relatively small tsunami or a larger event. And then next would be the forward models. The forward models are actually more or less the same models that are used in the tsunami warning system. So we define a scenario, for example, an earthquake of certain magnitude at a certain location with ruptured, and then we can tell get information about the inundation of the coast, and we can compare the inundation parameters that we get from the forward models and compare them to the actual distribution of the tsunami deposits. And then we see if the scenario we choose fits to the depositional evidence. And so if we are lucky, we can indeed reconstruct the triggering mechanism, so that scenario that triggered the tsunami. I start with inverse modeling, and we use both boulders and fine-grained deposits. The main input parameters we need for the boulders are the volume of the boulder, its density, and the pre-transport, pre-event location. In this case, as I said before, the boulder comes from the intertidal zone. So it was sitting in the water, and this plays a role because a boulder that was submerged in water is easier to lift compared to a boulder already sitting like this one on the coastal plain. For the sand deposits, we need the grain size, the thickness, and the density of the components. And for both boulders and fine-grained deposits, we need the pre-tsunami topography, which is actually the slope of the coastal plain, and the bottom roughness, for example, if it's a bare rocky platform, or if there is vegetation, and if so, what kind of vegetation covers the ground. To start with the fine-grained deposits, here's an example from Peru, northern Peru. This is a typical tsunami deposit, undulating, erosive base. The deposit itself is coarser than the under and overlying deposits. If we would look closer, we could see a slight normal grading, and you can see rock and shelf fragments that are part of this deposit. So what we need is the grain size of the deposit, its thickness, and the density of the components. And then the model calculates the flow depths and speed necessary to entrain and transport the given volume of sediment with the respective grain size and weight of the components. In this case, we got a flow depth of about 6 meters and a flow speed of close to 8 meters per second. And the age here is about 1649 plus minus 26 AD. We were pretty surprised when we got those flow parameters, because we choose the field site as there was a tsunami in 1996, the Chimbote tsunami. And the Chimbote tsunami, the flow parameters were documented by the army in northern Peru, and are pretty much the same than for this historical event. So we think this is kind of a predecessor of the Chimbote tsunami that happened around 350 years ago. So this brings me back to the preservation potential, and you have seen the example from Chile before. I said the thickness was reduced to less than half. But if you look at the grain size, you also see that the grain size changes. The initial tsunami deposits were slightly coarser compared to the deposit in 2012 and 13. And this is because the bioturbation mixes the fine-grained loamy particles of the soil into the tsunami deposit. And so it's getting finer. And it's not only the grain size and the thickness that change, but also the density of the components, because actually the composition changes. Just after the event, the unit, as you can tell from the color, is very rich in heavy minerals. It's about 90% heavy minerals, both magnetic and non-magnetic heavy minerals. Few organics, feldspar, and quartz. 3 years later, the percentage of heavy minerals was down to 42% only. So we lost a lot of heavy minerals, more than half. The organics are 21%. This is because of the mixing with organic components from the soil. And because we have a decrease in heavy minerals, we had a really relative increase in quartz and feldspar. And if you remember, the density, the thickness, and the grain size are the main components needed to calculate the flow parameters, and they all change through time. So running the inverse model would give around 4.2 meters per second flow velocity for the fresh deposit. But 3 years later, the result we get is 2.5. So what the model gives us that flow velocity changes dramatically, as you see. And then we're going to have a look at the boulders. The input parameters are the density, volume, and the pre-transport location. And so we take a sample to the lab to get the density measured. We have to measure the volume in the field because we can't take the boulders back home. This is mostly done by structure from motion. So I take overlapping photos of the boulders, and then I use the software, and the software stitches together those photos. It creates a 3D point cloud, and from the point cloud, we get the actual volume of the boulder. And again, pre-transport location, in some cases, it's really easy to guess where the boulder is coming from. Like here, this is on Anegada, and this is a coral boulder, and the corals were transported from the reef on land. So the boulders, the corals were still alive when they were transported on shore. So we know they are coming from the reef. We got a flow velocity required to move this coral, which is about 3.4 meters per second. And so this brings me back to Anegada, and Ryan Atwater talked about Anegada yesterday. So I want to show you the evidence we found on Anegada and how we can use the evidence to get an information about the event itself, about the flow parameters, and also about possible scenarios of earthquakes that may have triggered the tsunami. Okay, Anegada is in the northeastern Caribbean, and the Puerto Rico Trench is very close, and there's also the Atlantic Ocean, so we have the possibility of a transatlantic tsunami like the 1755 Lisbon event. The evidence we see on Anegada is, for example, here it's breaches in dune ridges. You can see these ridges are cut, they are truncated, and this is where the water flew to the central part of the island. And there's an area of breaches here. There's another set of breaches in this region and also here. So the location already points to a main inundation from north to south, more or less. We also find sand sheets also on the north of Anegada. So it thickens on the north shore, and it thins over nearly 2 kilometers towards the south. The sand was found up to close to 5 meters above sea level, and the thickness is at maximum 20 centimeters. And as you can see on this photo, it's not only sand, it's cobbles and boulders also within the sand. And then if we look closer, we can even see a lot of shells, gastropods. They all come from the reef and from the lagoon, so they have a marine source. Yeah, and we find two types of boulders. One are the coral boulders. They come from the reef. And the other source are small headlands on the island, and they provide Pleistocene limestone boulders. Here is a few in this area, and you see the coral boulders are really very common. On this photo, you can see at least 6 larger corals. And in total, we mapped more than 100 coral boulders in this area of the island. They are found even 1.5 kilometers inland and as high as 4 meters above the sea level. Here is a small boulder field of limestone boulders. We have point sources for those boulders, small headlands and knobs. And here you can see the source of the boulders is somewhere here. And you see a very narrow line of boulders, and this implies that the flow direction was more or less this way. This is a salt pond, so the sea would be behind the dunes here. This means that the tsunami or the inundation picked up the boulders here and transported them into the salt pond. So to conclude, the main flow direction on Anegada is north to south, more or less, shown by the breaches, shown by the way the boulders took. The reef is out here. Here's a boulder, and there are plenty of boulders in red color here. And in white, this is sand which was transported from the lagoon and from the beach inland. And here's the elongated boulder field. The largest boulder is this one, coral boulder. It has a weight of 14 tons, and it was transported from the reef here over the beach, the dunes, into this area. And for those 2 largest boulders, coral boulder, we got a flow velocity needed to transport it of 4.7 meters per second, and the largest limestone boulder required 5.2 meters per second. We also found evidence about transport modes, and this is a boulder field where you see it's actually limestone slabs. So these boulders are flat. And some of these boulders create kind of stacks. And if you look here, the boulders, the slabs all show an alignment, which is pretty much the same for all those boulders. And this is because the slabs align relative to flow direction. And the orientation of those boulders also indicates the flow direction, again, from the sea towards the land. And the second thing which is important here is imbrication is a structure which is only created during bed load transport as sliding. Otherwise, if the boulders would roll, you won't get the orientation in flow direction. And so we know these boulders were transported as bed load by sliding. And the transport modes are directly related to flow velocity. So first, the boulder or class is stable, and with increasing flow velocity, the boulders start to slide, and then the flow velocity increases and they start to roll, saltate, and finally they would be transported in suspension. So the velocity in this boulder field is a very narrow range just after the boulder's transport was initiated and before the first boulders start to roll. And we can actually calculate the flow velocity for this range. And here are the results. We used the equations from Nandasena, and here this is these are single boulders in this field, and you see in blue this is stable. So I said all boulders must be moving by sliding to create the imbrication. And you see all boulders move or are sliding at around 2.5 meters per second. And then at around 2.9 meters per second, the first boulder would start to roll. And if it rolls, it wouldn't create an imbrication. So we can say this boulder field was created at a flow velocity between 2.5 to 2.9 meters per second, which is pretty precise, I would say. And then the final step would be forward modeling. So we want to know what caused the tsunami. And the evidence points to something that happened or propagated towards the North Shore coming from the Atlantic Ocean. So this could be a transatlantic tsunami, or it could be a tsunami, for example, triggered by an earthquake in the Puerto Rico Trench. And so what was done in the recent years by several authors was they kind of defined scenarios for earthquakes that could have created or generated a tsunami on Anegada. And you see they actually divided the Puerto Rico Trench in different segments, and then they ruptured single segments and combinations of segments with earthquakes of different magnitudes, but also of different vertical slip. And in addition, there was the modeling of the Lisbon event, several different tsunamis generated by earthquakes offshore Portugal. And I want to show you some results. So the first one is the Lisbon tsunami. And you see the location of the boulders and the sand in different symbols. And as the tsunami approaches Anegada, about 7.5 hours after the earthquake, parts of the island get inundated, but you see most of the areas where we find the geological evidence is actually not inundated. So this scenario, a 1755 Lisbon event, cannot explain the distribution of the boulders and sand on the island. And this is another map of the Lisbon event. So you see in different colors, these are the areas that are inundated. This is the water level in meters. And you see that only a few areas are really inundated. Okay, next, this is a map showing the inundation of a Hispaniola Trench earthquake-related tsunami with a magnitude, earthquake magnitude of roughly 8.5. And here it's the flow speed that's depicted on the map in different colors. And here's the location of the largest coral boulder, which requires 3.4 meters per second at least to be transported. And here's the largest Pleistocene limestone boulder, which requires 5.2 meters per second. And as you can see from the color coding, these flow velocities are not reached here. So this scenario, even it does inundate large parts of the island, cannot explain the emplacement of the boulders. So we need to find another scenario. And this most probable scenario, I would say, is this one here. You see the entire island, nearly the entire island is flooded. All places where we find the boulders are flooded, and the flow velocities for each boulder at the locations are sufficient to transport the boulders. And this is a earthquake in the Puerto Rico Trench, rupturing 3 segments, segment 4 to 6, with a magnitude earthquake 8.4 and a slip of 7.5. And this would actually reach Anegada only 7 minutes after the earthquake. And so this is the inundation map for this event. Again, you see the water level here in different colors, and it's only the highest region of the island which is not flooded, and all the locations where we find the evidence are actually flooded. So my conclusions are that, of course, tsunami research, like we all conducted, requires different approaches. It's a combination of the post-event surveys, the resurveys, and also the search for the historic or prehistoric events. And then we have to complement the studies using numerical modeling. And so with these approaches, we can reconstruct the events from the deposits themselves. We can quantify the recurrence intervals, which are, of course, maximum time spans and the minimum intensities from the inverse modeling. And then using the forward modeling, we can also determine the triggers, so the scenarios that might be capable of generating the tsunami. And this finally is, of course, very important for risk assessment and for the improvement of the tsunami preparedness in general. Okay, and with this, I'm gonna thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Michaela Spiske, for your wonderful presentation. And we have observed the various tsunami depositional features and its characteristics in a regional studies. Now I would like to invite participants can ask questions. Yes, Dr. Maria Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you. Really nice talk and really interesting. Congratulations. I have a question because I was wondering about the example that you show from Chile. Was this analysis based only on one site, or did you measure several sites to determine that the preservation was poor? And I'm asking this because after this event, I also worked with the post-tsunami survey team, and I realized that even 1 meter difference from one site to another might be very important, because in some times I could see that there was scour in some places, and just 1 meter next to that site, there was deposition. So just wonder if you tested several sites to come with this conclusion on, and I am aware of the problem of preservation of sediments, even more in the tropics. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we visited several sites. So all locations where we went for the post-event survey, we also visited during the resurveys. And at this specific site, I've shown it's La Trinchera. It's a coastal plain which was covered by tsunami sand. And we did not only look at one trench, but we covered the entire coastal plain, and we dug trenches at several locations. And of course, the let's say, for example, the thickness of the deposit is absolutely site specific. As you said, if you go just 10 meters away, the thickness is different, or there is maybe no tsunami deposit. But the overall picture was really that everywhere where we went, the deposits got modified. The intensity was, of course, different. But changes were detectable at every site. At some sites, the tsunami deposit was even completely eroded.
And just a final question in relation to this, just to give a more optimistic view about the geologic approach of assessing tsunami hazard. Apart from the sediment, I think we have more and more tools coming on, and I did mention in my talk that some people are using DNA and also geochemistry, because even, I mean, probably you observed during the 2010 tsunami that the inundation of water, without sediments was even further away than the deposition of sediments. So that means that sometimes we misestimate with the deposit itself, the sediment deposit, the inundation distance. So maybe we can use other tools like geochem or DNA for those that can afford it. So just to see the value of other approaches and proxies to estimate. What do you think about that? I mean, do you have any experience on?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are several examples where, for example, geochemical analysis and also DNA analysis have shown that you can trace the inundation, so the maximum extent of the inundation, further inland than you can trace the actual sediment distribution. That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, one question is from Beverly Goodman. The question is that how might density of water flow, that is sediment concentration or velocity, impact velocity estimate related to imbrication? That means sliding.
Yeah, the density of the flow plays actually a very important role. Because the angle of imbrication, like the angle between the surface and the inclined boulder, is actually a measure of the density of the flow, which means the more boulders and sediments are incorporated in the flow, the steeper the angle of imbrication is. If you have not a lot of boulders in the flow, the imbrication angle is very low. But if you have a lot of boulders, the inclination is much steeper. So yes, it plays a very important role. But the angle of the imbrication is a measure, not an absolute measure, but a relative measure of the amount of sediment and boulders transported.
Yes, Dr. Mohammed Mukhtar.
And thank you very much for the brilliant presentation, and the data which you provided was really excellent to see. And it's just a very unique data set, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is about the boulders. I think, as I mentioned yesterday, we are really new in Macron region with all this follow tsunami work. And we're trying now really stage of learning, newly born anyway. Therefore, what some questions which I will have, it's very elementary, but the question is, the boulder which we're talking about it, are we talking about a single site of a boulder, or there are kind of several of them at the same place, or at the same time, what we are thinking about, that the roundness of the boulders, is that can that be a kind of a distinction, the measure of the distance has been kind of taken place, or source of the power of the storm or tsunami? I mean, of course, as I understood, sometimes it will be difficult to distinguish between these two together, but I'm sure there must be some element that we can use that to be able to distinguish. Thank you very much, Michaela.
Yeah, you're welcome. The questions you ask are of course very important, because the distribution of the boulders is directly related to the source. If we have a point source, like for the Pleistocene limestone boulders on Anegada, you get a very narrow boulder field only. So there is no wide distribution of boulders. But also in the case of Anegada, we have a fringing reef all along the north of the island. And so the coral boulders coming from the reef are distributed all over the north shore of the island. So it's really, you walk along the north shore and you just see a coral boulder here and the next there. So it's more than 100, probably close to 200 coral boulders along the island. So they are really distributed and found everywhere. So it's really the distribution of the boulders onshore is a measure of the source. Where is the source? Is it a line source or a point source? And for the roundness, I mean, in Anegada, we have the very round corals, but they are round because the corals grow like a sphere. And those spherical boulders are, of course, much easier to be transported because they can easily roll compared to kind of a slab or a flat boulder. So the shape plays a role in the transport. So how easy transport is going to be initiated, but the transport of the boulders during a tsunami, the transport distance is something like between a few hundreds of meters to maybe a kilometer or two. And this distance is not sufficient enough to kind of round the boulder during transport. Like we know the rounding of sand grains during a river transport. But for this, you need tens of kilometers, and this is not the case for a tsunami. What can happen is that the boulders collide during the tsunami transport and break into smaller parts or pieces of boulders. But there's actually no rounding during the transport.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Sambit, present.
I have one question, like, so you gave us some example about the some widely distributed island and then tsunami. So if we have tsunami in area like a Gulf, so where you have inland earthquakes, but the Gulf area have submarine landslide, and then that causes tsunami. So what kind of is the tsunami deposit created by submarine earthquakes, and then the inland earthquakes deposit is similar, or they will be different in nature or something like that?
Well, it's really hard to tell. I mean, from the hydrodynamic view, a tsunami wave generated by an earthquake is different to a tsunami wave generated by a submarine slide. But we have to. We don't have enough examples to really tell the difference. What we are currently doing, and we as Jessica Pilarczyk and I, we are working on the paleo tsunami deposits, and we try to find if there is any information, for example, on the composition of the deposit, including the diatoms and foraminiferal content, and compare it to an earthquake-related tsunami. But at this point, we don't have enough data really to say something about that.
Okay, thank you. And because like the 2018 Palu earthquake, so that debate is going on that tsunami was generated by submarine landslide, and then someone is arguing that it was. So that's why it came to my mind actually. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Michaela Spiske. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor James Goff. We are pleased to welcome our next speaker. He is an honorary professor of tsunami research at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and visiting professor at the University of Southampton in the UK. Up to 2016, he was the Deputy Director of the Paleontology, Geobiology, and Earth Archives Research Center, and the Director of the Australia Pacific Tsunami Research Center at the UNSW. He has published 4 books and well over 300 peer-reviewed publications. He is interested in tsunamis and all aspects of tsunamis, risk and vulnerability assessment, disaster and emergency management. Today, he will be sharing with us his expert work in search of Holocene trans-Pacific paleo-tsunamis. I request Professor James Goff to please share your presentation with us. Please.
Hopefully, I've just done that. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. Well, like the other presenters, I really appreciate the invitation and the offer to give a talk. So it's good to see all the excellent work that's been done. I'm going to try, in a sense, pull together some of the various strands and see what we can actually do with the paleo tsunami deposits that we've got. With that in mind, I've got a lovely picture here of the tsunami amplitudes for the 1700 Cascadia event going across the Pacific. Now, I will come back to that one a little later on, but it's one I think that we all know, so it's always nice to start with something familiar. Basically, the premise for what I'm doing here was a paper that I wrote back in 2011, where essentially I said that each Pacific island can represent a point source of information. So what we can do then is use paleo-tsunami deposits, the same data on various Pacific islands, and try to work out exactly where they come from. So paleo dart boys, if you wish. The only figure I could find of any use that showed the kind of effect that subduction zones all around the Pacific can have is this one from Geoscience Australia in 2007. It's a fairly rudimentary bit of modeling, but on the other hand, it does show you that the Pacific is not necessarily a great place to live. So I think if we first of all look at what I would call the 2 most iconic historical tsunamis we can think of, we got the 1960 Valdivia one from Chile and the 1946 Aleutian one, obviously from the US. And just looking at those to start with, you can see that, for example, if you live in the Hawaiian Islands, you're going to expect a few surprises from time to time. Now, Kenji Satake wrote a paper last year with others, and he pointed out some rather interesting points. He said that if you use models, we've seen a lot of good models in the presentations, and historical data, they can actually help us figure out where we should be looking for paleo tsunami deposits. They were looking globally, but it stands for the Pacific, and that works to an extent, and I'll get back to that one. They also point out that realistically, you're going to need a big event, magnitude 9, there or thereabouts, slightly smaller, slightly bigger, to generate a large enough set of waves capable of leaving a deposit in a distal location. So, for example, if you generate it in Chile, will you leave something in Japan? That kind of thing. So it's got to be recognizable, and you've seen from Michaela's last talk, but trying to find a recognizable tsunami deposit, even from a local event, becomes a little difficult over time. Now, the number of magnitude 9 or greater events, they said, came to around about 5 per century globally. Now, if we sort of dial that down slightly for the Pacific, anything over about a magnitude 8.5 happens about every 250 years for most of the subduction zones. Now, that means, as you can simply see from these two images, that if you live in the Hawaiian Islands, you're going to be getting more than one every 250 years. You're going to be getting one probably quite frequently. So there are certain places that immediately come to mind as good spots to look for paleo tsunami deposits. So if we look at the historically documented, or where we have actually reported tsunami deposits, I'm not necessarily saying where at the time someone said, oh, it deposited some sand, is where we scientists have actually managed to find deposits related to these events. But the models are good, and the deposits, one would assume, are most likely going to be found where the amplitudes are highest. So, for example, with the 1960 on the left, we can see Easter Island, Easter Island, the Marquesas, Hawaii, that's the big island of Hawaii, Japan, New Zealand and Samoa. Now, I've highlighted New Zealand and Samoa. I'll come back to that in a second. We'll see here, incidentally, this is the 1960 damage caused to Ahu Tongariki, which is the most significant monumental structure on Easter Island. It was destroyed and carried probably in the region of about 100 meters inland, and subsequently rebuilt in an archaeological project about 20 years later. So when you go there as a tourist, you see what is essentially a reconstruction of this. Now, the 1946 event, again, we see the Hawaiian Islands really got hit hard. So we see it on the big island of Hawaii, we see it on Kauai, and we see it on Oahu. We also see it in the Marquesas and also in California. Now, those two things immediately sort of throw up a couple of points. First of all, well, California is somewhat off the beaten track of the tsunami amplitudes, according to the modeling at least. And then equally of the 1960, we've got New Zealand and Samoa getting struck, and they are certainly not on the main tsunami amplitude pathways, but we still find deposits for them. So you can actually find these things off the main event, so to speak. So having made that point, I think we can drift back slightly further in time and we come back to the 1700 Cascadia event. Now this was what I call a hybrid event. It was historical in Japan, but it's prehistoric in the Pacific Northwest. Now in those historical accounts, as far as I'm aware, there's been no split that has been pointed out as being the 1700 Cascadia tsunami deposit. There is an event at Miyako on the Sanriku coast. It's event layer E5, which is considered one of three candidates for that event, but it hasn't necessarily been definitively assigned to that. But it's interesting when you look at other distal locations. You know, we have down here, we have the Solomon Islands and we have Papua New Guinea. They seem to get the same amount of tsunami amplitude as Japan. No one's ever looked there as far as I'm aware. The northern shores of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea would be certainly challenging places to look because they have their own seismic activity and tsunamigenic earthquakes. But the point remains that those are potential sources, potential areas to be looking for the 1700. But equally, there's a vast area in this area around here, the Federated States of Micronesia, Micronesia in general, the entire western part of the Pacific there, where no one has actually done any tsunami or paleo tsunami work, as far as I'm aware, apart from maybe one piece of work. So again, huge areas of the Pacific that can be looked at. But what about the Hawaiian Islands? Now, I've had chats with people from the US Geological Survey, and we've worked on the Hawaiian Islands together. And it stands out to my mind that the 1700 AD deposit will be there somewhere. And that's a point that I will come back to a little later on. but it is a midway point. It hasn't even got as far as Japan. It's getting hit by some fairly significant wave heights, and it's certainly a high probability that we should be finding it there. So sadly, or not, I guess is the best way of saying it, we haven't got any historical event and modeling and historical data from a 1700 equivalent, which is probably quite lucky at the moment. Small or otherwise though, so we haven't got that historical guide to give us a hint as to where we should be looking yet. But the Hawaiian Islands are a remarkably interesting place. The diagram here shows you the run-up heights around all the Hawaiian Islands related to the two significant events I'm talking about, the 1960 and the 1946. Now, two things become sort of immediately apparent. The 1960 came from the southeast, and it's primarily the southeastern islands that are getting the worst of the run-ups, and in particular on the Big Island, it's the southeast coast is getting probably the most of them. The reason why you see a large spike on the northeastern side and then you look at the 1946 and you see that it's primarily the northern shores of most of the islands that are getting affected. Now, this is a general rule of thumb that works for all of the events that have affected the Hawaiian Islands. You tend to find the higher run-ups on the shores that are facing where the event came from. So that's great. Unfortunately, the Big Island, which is the one that seems to resonate nicely and we get some nice inundations there, unfortunately, it's a very young volcanic island, and apart from a couple of spots in the north, it really only has very limited accommodation space. And as such, to date, in most of the place, certainly in Hilo, we've only gone back to 1946, and then you hit a lava flow. So that's not particularly helpful at all. In the northern part, we have certainly gone back further to an event that was probably about 600 years ago or something like that. But again, these are very rare places to find on the Big Island. As you go further west, the islands are getting older, the volcanics are getting older, there's more accommodation space, there's a greater number of embayments and wetlands to be looking in. But apart from Kauai, it's been incredibly poorly studied for Holocene paleo-tsunamis. For me, both Maui and Molokai offer what I would say are the best places to look, the lowest hanging fruit. If you look at Maui, which is this one here, it seems to have some decent run-ups for both the 60 and the 46, and that bodes well for finding evidence for paleo-tsunamis from multiple sources, I should think. On Kauai, the USGS have done some work. They found evidence for 57 and 46 from the Aleutians. And they also found an event, possibly maybe a single event, an event somewhere between 500 and 750 years ago. The big question there, as you can see from the little, this is Kauai, by the way, you can see at the northern side here, a couple of sites, both on the northern shore, both therefore exposed to Aleutian sources, but equally potentially exposed to Cascadia sources. So it's very easy for us to say, okay, it's an Aleutian event, let's go and see what we can find there. However, there should be, I think, a certain amount of care being taken, and we should be looking for possible Cascadia events as well. Now, as Michaela's pointed out and others, you know, these deposits are going to be from a reasonably long way off. The waves from Cascadia may not be as large as those from the Aleutians. We may not be finding particularly thick deposits. They may unfortunately arrive just after a large Aleutian event has arrived and there's not much sediment to move. However, it is another source for the northern shores of the Hawaiian Islands. Now, Kauai is another interesting little spot. Makauwahi Cave on the southeastern side of Kauai has been an interesting source of discussion for a few years now. Butler and others, the most recent one, I think in 2017, have come up with a date for an event they found there in a cave that comes to somewhere between 1551 and 1593. there's an extreme desire, as far as I can see, for that to have come from the Aleutians. And there was a link made with an orphan tsunami along the Japanese coast. But just last year, Kenji Satake and others pointed out that that actual historical account was incorrect, and so that can be discounted. So the question therefore becomes, where did that one come from? We're looking for trans-Pacific events. There have to be some other potential sources. Now, it's wonderfully seductive to say, was this the 1575 from Chile, the precursor to the 1960, an event that was of the same magnitude, possibly slightly more, possibly slightly less, so a big event. And the 1960 is an historical guide for us. And if we look at the 1960 run-ups on Kauai in this part of the island, it's not entirely very impressive. So it seems unlikely, although the date range is wonderfully nice and seems to fit well. So you then have to start looking elsewhere. And if we think of, say, Cascadia, which is about the only other one I can think of potential relevance to this, there's the T2, which is dated to somewhere between 1402 and 1502. So that's a bit too young, a bit too old. So again, it's unlikely. So once you've started knocking out the sources that are potentially available for that, realistically, we start to see, well, okay, that's probably more likely to be from a local flank collapse source. And again, if we look in the historical records, we do actually have something of an example from that historically. The 1869 AD tsunami that struck the southeastern shores of both Maui and the Big Island of Hawaii. That one looks most likely to have come from the Puna Ridge, which is just off to the eastern side of the Big Island here. So having looked at that, having found out where you only find these events in very few places, it would appear the most reasonable explanation for that one at the moment is that it's from a local flank collapse. So the Hawaiian Islands are exciting places to look at. Let's head south at some familiar hunting. And I've got some thoughts here on an event, 3,800-year-old event that was found in the Chatham Island archipelago, which is about 800 kilometers east of New Zealand. It's their most easterly land. When looking at this, and you can see some of the what we're looking at here, this is both a very significant boulder deposit. There are boulders up to about 90 tons, as I recall, something in that range. It's also associated with a fine sediment deposit into which these boulders are countersunk. The deposit extends up to a kilometer inland, so it's a very impressive site. The first time I went there in 2004, I completely missed it. I walked through it looking for a normal sandy tsunami deposit, wondering what on earth these boulders were doing in the way of me being able to dig a hole. It's amazing what you could learn over the years. So this was an amazing event. And while at the time we were doing this work and struggling to work out where it came from, we did some numerical modeling and we were thinking, well, we know how high the wave's got to be to move this. Let's see what we can do. At exactly the same time, there were researchers in New Zealand who were trying to find out the worst case scenario distant sourced tsunami for New Zealand. And they worked out that it was a magnitude 9.4, possibly slightly unrealistic maybe, coming from northern Chile. Now, fortunately, we have something of a sort of an historical guide for this. There's both the 1868 that came from that area, but then the most recent one was the 2014 Akike, an 8.1 tsunami that came from northern Chile. So we can have a look at that. And those blue lines are essentially the 5 centimeter computed tsunami amplitude. I chose that because it shows these nice fingers of high amplitude heading out into the South Pacific and a little bit leaking into the north. Imagine an event much larger than this, and you start to think, well, where are we going to find paleo tsunami deposits potentially in these distant sources throughout the Pacific? The Chatham Island deposit was here. And when we start looking at records and work there myself, we see that, for example, there are 2 other sites on the east coast of New Zealand. There are 2% potential sites on the eastern side of Australia. There's one in Vanuatu, and this picture here shows that deposit with a occupation site dug into it afterwards. And there's also one potential one on in American Samoa on the island of Ta'u. Now, all of these are in the direct line of fire from the 2014, but also the 1868. But a magnitude 9.4 along the South American Nazca plates, well, yes. 2019, Leon and others found evidence for an incredibly, a giant earthquake, approximately 1,000-kilometer long megathrust 3,800 years ago. Now, this wasn't just geological evidence for the tsunami, it was geological evidence for the earthquake and archaeological evidence of significant cultural impact to the hunter-gatherer communities at the time all along that coast. So this is a phenomenal, a wonderful piece of work where essentially the geology was started first in New Zealand and actually in Vanuatu and places like that first. And these were sitting as isolated outliers of where on earth could these events have come from. And then the modeling data comes along and you start to say, well, that's remarkably interesting. And the two have worked together remarkably well. And it's incredibly exciting. The work is still going on with this, and there's paper due out soon, I think. So speaking as both a New Zealander and a Brit, from New Zealand's point of view, it's rather nice to see if New Zealand could return the favour to Chile. And I've spent many years, at least 20 years now, investigating paleotsunamis associated with the Tonga Trench. Now, 3 events fit on my work that I've done. There's one in the 15th century, there's one 2,000 years ago, and there's one 3,000 years ago. Now, the one I'm going to talk about for this talk is the 15th century. This is where we have a case of the geology first, model second, and then the geology third again. So again, this wonderful iterative process going on where the two are working together. Now, if you look at the map, or this wonderful map, it's a magnitude 9.4 central Tonga Trench earthquake. If you think about the one in Chile that I just mentioned, that was a magnitude 9.4, and it involved the rupture of 3 segments. The same thing applies for the central Tonga Trench. Now, we have incredibly good evidence for one in Chile, and I think we have pretty damn good evidence for this one in Tonga as well. All the ones with the white dots are dated events that fit with a mid-15th century there or thereabouts. When I say mid-15th century, it's probably between about 1420, 1480, so it's in that range. All of those are either paleotsunami deposits and archaeological data, paleotsunami deposits and archaeological data and anthropological data, as in oral traditions, or one of those, or a combination of them. So it's not just relying on geological information, and that's where particularly working in the Pacific becomes very important. There are oral traditions. There has been archaeology done in the Pacific for the past 200 years, and we're just catching up. We're new kids on the block from a paleotsunami point of view. So there's a lot to learn from what's been done in the archaeology. So, for example, we have the Cook Islands. There's an oral tradition on the Cook Islands. That one's here. Here in Henderson, we have archaeological information of occupation sites that were overlain by deposit, and then people came back and reoccupied. Throughout this entire period of time in the mid-15th century, throughout the entire South Pacific, there is a breakdown in the long-distance voyaging, canoe voyaging. So there's a breakdown in trade. Islands become isolated. There is a loss of resources because of tsunami inundation. There is a movement of coastal populations inland and uphill. Subsequently, some coming back down again and reoccupying sites, others staying uphill, so that when the missionaries first arrived in the late 1700s, a lot of people were still living up in the hills and had to be tempted back down to the coast for trading and so on. Now, as we head further away from that central point, we're doing quite well. There are a lot of quite near sort events, deposits that are close to where this earthquake happened. But we get further away and you start to question what you're looking at. For example, on Easter Island, there is stories of a potential tsunami that struck there, but it seems to be in the 16th century, so a little bit too late. And I'll come back to that one a little bit later. If we go to the northeast, and Teresa gave lovely talks about her stuff yesterday, you know, there's a lovely strand of high amplitude heading off towards the Pacific coast of Mexico, and it's extraordinarily tempting to say to yourself, well, okay, most of the events there are 14th century, but could we squeeze any into the 15th? Or further to the south, further to the southeast along that coastline, and even towards Ecuador, it's entirely possible that there might be some distantly sourced deposits there that have come from the Tonga Trench. And perhaps the most intriguing one of all of this is the evidence along the Chilean coast. And there's really, I suppose, three main areas. There's the area I've just called Tal area, which would be the Atacama Desert. Work there, Leon et al. Did find a much younger tsunami deposit, again, a big one, which is poorly dated. So I've only put a big question mark against that. It's somewhere younger than 1,000 years old. So plenty of events to play with there, but it's still put down as a possibility. La Serena Coquimbo, there's a paper coming out for an event that fits exactly with the timing of the Tonga Trench. And within that paper, it is suggested that it is possibly related to a Tonga Trench earthquake, to the point where when we did a detailed analysis of the wave heights at the coastline as a result of this particular rupture scenario, the inundation is sufficient to have deposited that deposit that has been found. So that's very exciting. I just mentioned Tairua, and I'm going to call it Kadiko. I have no idea. I'll be corrected, no doubt. But we have Nentwig, and we also got Dura, who have found deposits down there that obviously have the right age to fit, but equally they also have a potential source just offshore called the Nazca South American Subduction Zone. So they probably don't fit. However, again, they're put down with a question mark. It is interesting. We get more and more distant with this evidence, and it becomes less and less clear. And that is also evident from the historical accounts. So it may be that for this, we're only finding those that are sitting there that are white dots. But on the other hand, there's still an awful lot of islands within that sphere of sort of intermediate sites that can be studied to figure out more potential sites. I should just mention that if the ones at Tairua and Kadiko are indeed mid-15th century, a large event, for example, from central Chile, then some of the sites like Pitcairn Island and maybe the Australs down here and some of these other ones may indeed be related to that one as opposed to that from Tonga Trench. It's only further work that is going to start giving us a much better idea of that. And then we come back to the same problem of which one came first, because if they were both big events, as Michaela pointed out, the one that came last could well have destroyed the evidence for the one that was slightly earlier. So it's interesting times. We've got to the point where we have a lot of information, far more than we had 10 years ago, far more than we had 20 years ago. And we can now start at least drawing lines on a map and starting to talk about these things. I've got a picture of the 1,600-ton boulder on Tonga, photographs from Fred Taylor, and a paper by Furlick et al. In 2009 in geology. Did a lovely bit of work. There's about 7 boulders there, as I recall, something like that. And they came up with a date of 120,000 years ago for this deposition. Now, the big blue dot on the map that I put here, I only inserted a couple of days ago because of a wonderful new paper that's just coming out. I think it's in press. I think you can get it on ResearchGate now. But this, a brilliant paper of which Raphael, who is listening, I think, was a co-author. They have found evidence for a mid-15th century tsunami on Tonga. I was almost cheering when I read this paper, because finally, after all these years, someone has been to Tonga and found evidence for an event there. Whether or not it was generated by an earthquake, you need to read their paper. But the fascinating thing is that the 1,600-ton boulder and its 6 companions is dated to the 15th century, not 120,000 years ago. Now that is exciting and very, very interesting. So where do we go from here? I think from the point of view of general events, and when I say general events, I mean almost any subduction zone around the Pacific, the Hawaiian Islands are the go-to place. The further west you go in the Hawaiian Islands, the older the volcanics are, better selection you've got of sites to look at along all coasts, all aspects. And there is the potential to build up what I'm starting to call a tsunami rose for Holocene Trans-Pacific tsunamis. I'm saying the 1700 will be there, and there'll be plenty of others too. And we can start to get an idea of sources coming from the northwest, east, and south. My low-hanging fruit, as I would call them, are Maui and Molokai. There is work that is going on Maui and continuing over the next few years. As far as I'm aware, no one is working on Molokai, and that's from my point of view a disgrace. The ditto for the Marquesas, absolutely stunning places to work, particularly Hiva-Oa, Nuka Hiva, and Oahuku. There are many other islands as well, but when you start looking at the records from the Marquesas and comparing them with the records from the Hawaiian Islands, you can really start to get a good sense of where some of these big events in the past have come from. And that's a very exciting way forward that I can see for general events, as I called it. With regards to my particular favorite of the Tonga Trench, I've said perhaps the most serious hole in our knowledge has actually probably just about been filled now, but that's Levine et al. In press, or 2021 if they get it out within the next 20 days. There is more work to be done on Tonga, a lot more. What they have done is shown what can be done on Tonga. The question remains as to what more there is to be found on Tonga, and that is very exciting. Just to the east of the Tonga Trench, and I haven't even put them on here, which is a disgrace, but the Cook Islands here, there are records there that have been reported for both very large cyclones and very large tsunamis. There are many islands in the southern Cooks, which are down this area. For example, there's Manaya, there's Moke, Mitiaro, and Attu. All of those have clifftop boulders on top of them, some of which have been assigned to tsunamis, some of which haven't. I think there's certainly more work that needs to be done on those. And then we come to the Chile megathrusts from both the northern and southern parts of Chile. Now, Easter Island, I say the 1960 destroyed Ahu Tongariki, but fascinatingly in the archaeological record, beautifully stated in an archaeological paper that says sometime after 1500 AD, not entirely clear, the Ahu Tongariki was first destroyed. So it's been destroyed twice. So sometime in the 1575 hybrid tsunami fits remarkably well with that. And also from the point of view of an historical guide, we have the 1960s showing that Ahu Tongariki was destroyed. Perhaps what we have is yet another event here recorded from destruction of monumental architecture there. Beyond that, we have the Austral Islands, which are between essentially Chile and New Zealand. These ones we know from archaeological records were affected by a mid-15th century event, but again, they are almost untouched. They would provide incredibly useful place to look for both events from Tonga and events from Chile as well. And of course, there's New Zealand, but New Zealand has got an endless number of potential sites to look at, and I think I have an endless number of papers to still write up on that. So putting it all together, there's a lot to be done. Let's get going. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure what happened there.
Anyone have questions?
Thank you, Professor. Participant can ask a question. Thank you, Professor James Goff.
Hey, no problem at all.
Yeah. And now I'm pleased to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Tina Dura, Assistant Professor from Virginia Tech Institute. She specializes in subduction zone paleogeodesy, which is a combination of coastal stratigraphy, sedimentology, micropaleontology, and paleoseismology. geophysical and sediment transport knowledge. Dr. Tina's lab is more specialized in diatom-based zone geodesy. She has published more than 50 peer-reviewed works. She was the NSF postdoctoral scholar, and she is holding a major research projects of various international bodies. Today, she is going to talk about the distant source tsunami from the Alaska altitude subduction zone and their impact in Southern California. I request Dr. Tina Dura share your presentation.
Okay, well, hi everyone. I'd like to thank the Namilinks organizers for having me today to present this work. I'm really excited about the project and looking forward to being involved in the future. So today I'm going to present some of the work I've done in Alaska with a team of other researchers, the USGS team named here, Rich Briggs, Simon Engelhardt, Peter Hausler, Rich Kaler, Alan Nelson, Rob Witter. I wanted to call them out because they've been a really important component of this work. And so I'd like to kind of cover some of the work we've done in the past and also go over a new paper that we just recently published on distant source tsunamis from this Alaska Aleutian subduction zone and how they may impact Southern California. All right, so I don't have to make the case for any of you that extending earthquake and tsunami records back in time is hugely beneficial for earthquake hazards assessments. I think we've established that. We have all this great data now about past earthquakes and a better idea of how subduction zones may behave in the future. As we know, having this geologic data in Sumatra, Thailand, in Japan and Chile has really given us a better picture of what kinds of earthquakes we can expect there in the future and could have been really useful in better preparing coastlines for these events before they happened. But I think there's room for growth, especially in the integration of coastal geologic and modeling studies that can consider this information that we now have, this geologic information that we have, and use that to now look at these future hazards and even look at these future hazards in the context of changing climate and sea level rise, which I hope I'll make the case for later in the presentation. Okay, so others have gone over this yesterday, but I just want to quickly go over the earthquake deformation cycle because it kind of provides the framework for the type of evidence that we find in the coastal geology. So as we know, in the interseismic period on a subduction zone, we have the downgoing oceanic plate is locked against the overriding continental plate. We have strain accumulating here, which causes deformation in the other upper plate. Some areas will bulge up, offshore gets dragged down in the interseismic period, and this is a period of gradual deformation that happens over centuries. During an earthquake, so the coseismic period, that strain is suddenly released. You have extension of the upper plate that causes subsidence in some areas. Offshore, we have that uplift that displaces the ocean floor and displaces water column and creates the tsunami. This change of the subsidence, and in some cases, if you have islands, you can preserve uplift as well. These land level changes are what we can have preserved in the coastal stratigraphic record, showing this, the deformation with the earthquake deformation cycle, and then the tsunami is something, an additional line of evidence that we sometimes find in these sections. So essentially, in this earthquake deformation cycle, you're looking at a series of relative sea level changes. During the interseismic period, you're seeing sea level fall along the coast as the land bulges up. And during an earthquake, as the land suddenly subsides, you're seeing a relative sea level rise. And that relative sea level rise can persist over centuries as this cycle repeats itself and you get build up to another earthquake. So what does this look like in the coastal stratigraphy? Well, first of all, where do we need to look? And others have mentioned this before, but we need to look at low energy depositional environments that are going to be sensitive to these changes in relative sea level, and that can preserve the changes in the land level that go along with the earthquake deformation cycle. So coastal intertidal marshes, lagoons, lakes even, basically any low energy depositional environment where a change in sea level will affect what is growing there and what likes to live there. So before an earthquake, you can see in this example, we have a high marsh deposit forming. During an earthquake, we have, in this example, coseismic subsidence. A tsunami comes in shortly afterwards, deposits a sand bed shown in the darker gray, And now you've dropped the land down for now decades to centuries, and you now have a new environment that is occurring there, and you get a tidal flat deposit that can be deposited on top of that sand. In the interseismic period, when in this example you have uplift, slowly the land is going to rise up out of the lower intertidal zone and start accumulating another soil on top. So you have this sequence of a buried soil with a sand on top and a tidal mud showing that land level change, and then slowly back into this high marsh deposit. And in a core, this looks like this nice example from Cascadia, where you have that soil overlying sand into a mud, and then slowly grading back into a soil in that interseismic period. So the evidence we look for are these really sharp contacts indicating a sudden change in that environment. In some cases, you don't get a tsunami sand at all, right? You might just have a mud overlying soil. In that case, we will also expect a sharp contact between those units, showing that sudden change in environment. A juxtaposition of environments. So this soil before, it was in a high marsh, and then suddenly you have a tidal flat deposit above it. So there is no intervening low marsh that you would expect if these changes were gradual. These contacts we want to see them be laterally continuous throughout the study area. So we're not looking at a localized process like tidal channel migration or some different configuration of the estuary that causes these contacts in the stratigraphy. We want to ideally correlate them between regional sites. Again, that's going to rule out the localized processes that might be occurring at one marsh. And sometimes when we're lucky, we get that tsunami deposit on top, and that really helps us argue that this deformation we're seeing that's shown from the soil to the mud, it was accompanied by this deformation that also produced a tsunami that deposited on top of that soil. Okay, so I specialize in diatom-based paleoseismic studies. It's one of the tools that we can use to characterize these ecologic changes in these cores. So diatoms are photosynthetic unicellular algae. They're in freshwater, brackish, and marine environments. For that reason, sometimes they can be advantageous over forams, which are only found in marine environments. But I don't want to disparage any microfossil group. They're all great. I think working together is the best. So diatoms are valuable in reconstructing these environmental changes I just talked about down core due to their preferences to a variety of environmental factors. So in earthquake and tsunami studies, we often use their preference for salinity and substrate. So that's going to create this zonation in the intertidal zone. If we look at this cross section here, we're going to have diatoms that like to live in more subtidal and tidal flat environments. These are diatoms that can tolerate high levels of salinity and live floating in the water column oftentimes. So a lot of times that's planktonic forms. As you go higher in the intertidal frame, you'll get some diatoms that might live attached to plants and in the muddier substrates. And then even higher, you get freshwater diatoms that are not very tolerant of salinity and can also live attached to plants, or sometimes can live subaerially for periods of time. So diatoms have this distinctive zonation in the intertidal zone. So over time, they get incorporated into the coastal sediments, and they're going to basically archive paleoenvironmental changes that are going on along the coast. And some of those might be related to the earthquake deformation cycle. And so that's why they're useful there. And they also can provide this independent test of the inferences we're making from the stratigraphy. So if we're not quite sure, is this really an intertidal mud, or is it, something, freshwater lake, kind of deposit, we can use diatoms to try to define what environment that sediment was deposited in. So just to go back to this diagram and this core, I'll just walk you through. In the high marsh deposit, we're going to have these freshwater diatoms you can see here at the bottom of the core. Let's use the pointer here. In the tsunami, we often find a mixed assemblage of diatoms because it's a very chaotic kind of event. It washes over a variety of intertidal and supertidal environments at times and can bring in diatoms from all over the place. Above the contact in the mud, you're going to find your subtidal or tidal flat diatoms. And then slowly it will transition back into brackish and then freshwater assemblage through that deformation cycle. So as I showed in the previous slide, that empirical relationship between modern diatoms to the elevation in the tidal frame can then be used to convert these fossil diatoms that we see down core into estimates of where sea level was at the time. And these can, at times be qualitative estimates where we basically just say, we know this went from the soil to this mud indicates the land went down. And we can also apply things like transfer functions and start to say, between this unit and this unit, the land must have gone down 1.5 meters based on the change in the diatom assemblages. With these more quantitative estimates, we can then incorporate the numbers basically into 3D elastic dislocation models that can help define where the rupture occurred offshore. So these methods, if applied to enough sites along strike, along the coast, can be really powerful in defining past ruptures along subduction zone. Okay, so microfossil-based studies have been applied quite a bit around the world. This is just a figure from a diatom paper that I wrote, just reviewing where diatoms had been applied around the world, but I did include a few papers here that incorporated forams as well. There's a very similar technique, and the ones I have in white are studies that I've been lucky enough to be a part of. So I've gotten around the world, which has been, I've been really lucky to do that, and I hope to continue on doing these studies. And today I just want to focus on the Alaska subduction zone and the work that I've been able to do there. We just had a paper come out a few days ago about some of the work that basically some of this paleoseismic work was a springboard for the new paper that just came out that I will also describe in a little bit. So here's Alaska subduction zone, and these colorful dots show different places that the USGS has been kind of leading the charge on doing some paleoseismic and paleotsunami studies on. And I've had a chance to go on about half of these expeditions. It's very remote, so hard to get to. And once we're there, we work very hard to try to characterize, the stratigraphy and what we're seeing on these. In some cases, I guess in all cases, it's on islands, right? So it's the Aleutian Islands, and then here's Kodiak Island that I don't think is officially an Aleutian Island, but nearby. So today, I want to focus on this area, the Western Kodiak Islands. This is Kodiak Island here. We just call this the Western Kodiak Island region in this area of the 1964 rupture and 1938 ruptures. And these series of islands here, which is Siklitic Island, Sitkinak Island, and Chirikov Island. But first I want to tell you about why we care about this part of the subduction zone. So it's very active here. We have one great earthquake every 13 years or so. So about over magnitude 8 is how I'm defining it here. About 1 magnitude 7 to 8 per year, and 6 magnitude 6 to 7 earthquakes per year. So it's very active, say, compared to the Cascadia subduction zone, which is just teasing us and not doing much of anything. So the subduction zone is highly coupled between Eastern Kodiak Island and the Shumagon Islands here, which is shown in this purple color. So it's locked, it's highly coupled, it's locked, it's accumulating strain, which means it is capable of producing these large earthquakes. So a particular concern of the subduction zone, of both, of course, regionally and locally, is the Samiti segment, and also it's of a concern for distant source tsunamis across the Pacific because it directs tsunamis. The orientation of the subduction zone there directs tsunamis towards the California coast. So this Samiti section is something that people have been looking at as a possibility for an earthquake that could cause some distant source tsunami impacts in Southern California. So the last earthquake on the Samiti section was in 1938. The last over magnitude 8 was in 1938. This did not reset the subduction zone in this region, but it released some of the strain that had accumulated there, but it's thought that, further earthquakes are possible. The USGS SAFIR scenario modeled an earthquake on the Samiti section to see what the distant source tsunami impacts would be in Southern California. They modeled the 9.1, so similar to Tohoku. They found that it would produce tsunamis with an amplitude of about 1 meter at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach that could produce up to $4.2 billion in damage, and that's in 2019 inflation adjusted dollars. So it's a section that we should be paying attention to. So the 1964 that everyone's probably heard about, 1964 magnitude 9.2 earthquake occurred on the Kodiak section to the east. And one thing we've been thinking about and what prompted some of the work we've done in the area is there a possibility of multi-section earthquakes in this area? So because the 1938 and 1964 earthquakes didn't overlap, this was thought of as a persistent boundary and actually included in earthquake hazard maps as a boundary to slip that might limit the magnitude of future earthquakes. But in our work, we are starting to see that in these islands here, Chirikov, Sitkinak, Siklitic, preserve the same series of earthquakes across this boundary, meaning that some eruptions have gone through it, and maybe we should be considering multi-section earthquakes. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that work that led to those thoughts. So first, to introduce islands, we have Chirikov Island, we have Siklitic Island, and we have Sitkinak Island. So here's Chirikov here. Here's Sitkinak and Siklitic. So they're well-positioned islands to catch tsunamis and land level change. They're in the right proximity to the subduction zone and also oriented in a way where the sites we looked at are facing the subduction zone and can catch those tsunamis. And the imagery shows that we have these nice low energy depositional environments here that can preserve this evidence as well. So that's why we targeted these islands to look at. So today I'm going to actually just focus on Sitkinak in the interest of time, but I will say later where we have found the similar evidence in the other islands, and the records have been pretty consistent between the three islands, at least for the most recent 3 events. Okay, I just want to call out my team again. This is a lot of the USGS crew here and kind of everything that people sort of bring to the table. Our goals at Sitkinak were to reconstruct land level change and tsunami inundation, characterize the slip during past ruptures, if we can, based on the direction of land level change we observed, evaluate that persistence of that proposed boundary. Do earthquakes always stop there? Can they propagate through? And, be able to provide a recommendation to update hazard maps if needed, if we do see that earthquakes can propagate through that boundary. All right, so this is the study site on Sitkinak Island, the main study site that we focused on. This is us standing on Camelback Ridge that we named, looking out over the South Lagoon study area. And this arrow is just indicating that we're looking south. And here's the study area here shown in the red square. And this is Camelback Ridge here. So we were looking out this way down into the South Sitkinak Lagoon. And so, our strategy in these studies basically is to go out and core. We do gouge coring, we do Russian coring. We look at the subsurface sediment and try to put together a story of how the environment has changed over time and how that relates to the earthquake deformation cycle. So you can see in this gouge core here, we have some changes between tidal muds and peats. So that was interesting. We started to see interesting things right away. This is just a picture accurately depicting what it feels like to work in Alaska many times, which is just wet and soggy and miserable, but always fun once you're done at the end of the day and you can reflect back. Outcrops were also available on Sitkinak Island, which were really useful. As you can see in this picture here, we could really start to see these changes in between the tidal mud and the peats. Also, modern sampling is important. We want to characterize what diatoms live in the modern environment, so then we can define better the environments down in the cores. And then, of course, a lot of surveying to get both the elevation of the cores relative to each other and also the elevation of everything relative to tidal datum, so we can tell how where things were deposited in the past and what the land has done deformation-wise in the meantime. And proxies. So we applied different proxies. We bring these samples back. We've, in this case, just used PVC pipe to sample a bank section here. In other cases, we do Russian coring, shown here. It's a similar sample taken by both those methods. We can apply LOI, loss on ignition, to look at the organic content, which in a core like this can be very useful. And of course, grain size analysis to pick up any tsunami, changes in the energy required to deposit the sediments we're looking at. Diatoms, so microfossils of many different kinds can be applied to these studies to characterize changes in environments. And then, of course, we need a chronology for the inferred tsunamis or earthquakes we're looking at. So we use radiocarbon dating and sometimes lead-210 and cesium-137 for those younger events. All right, so this is a pretty busy diagram. I just want to show you the amount of coring and correlations that we did at Sitkinak. We're going to focus on Transect 3, which was that area in South Sitkinak Lagoon, because this is where we found the lower cores that recorded what we infer are land level changes from past earthquakes. So this is highlighting this core here, WS5. So you can see here that we have plotted the subsurface stratigraphy. We have our core photo, CT scans, which are really useful in picking out these contacts. And we can see that in South Sitkinak Lagoon, the stratigraphy was very interesting because in some cases across these sharp contacts, we would see a change between a peat and a mud. And in other cases, we would go from a mud to a peat. And here again, a less organic unit to a more organic unit. And in this case, we went the opposite direction. So we interpreted this as basically a mixed land level change signal. So, in some cases, the sediments were preserving coseismic uplift, in other cases, coseismic subsidence. But of course, we wanted to test that inference, and we used diatoms to do that. And this is just a very rough schematic of the types of diatoms that I found in the tidal flat, low marsh, high marsh, and upland environments at Sitkinak Island. And this is just more pretty photos of diatoms. I can't resist, they're so pretty. I want to show everybody how pretty diatoms are. And so basically, you go and you use those modern transects that we did and characterize what lives in each of those intertidal zones. And then that can help you then go down core and make some interpretations about how the environment is changing across these contexts. So I'll start by with the bottom of the core, showing that across this contact here at the bottom, we can see a change between a tidal flat mud, the diatoms indicate, overlain by a high marsh peat. Across the contact above that, we have a high marsh unit indicated by the diatoms, overlain by a tidal flat deposit. And then in the contact above that, we have a tidal flat overlain by a high marsh deposit. So you can see that juxtaposition of environments that I mentioned before across these contexts, a low marsh to a high marsh in this case, and a low marsh to a tidal flat. And so we interpreted this by these arrows here as, when you have your transition from a higher environment to a lower environment, we have subsidence. And then when you have a tidal flat to a high marsh, for example, we interpreted that as uplift. So we have this stratigraphic section that records a mixed signal of uplift and subsidence. And I just want to focus on the top 3 events because those are the 3 that correlate across the 3 islands that I mentioned earlier. And so we dated those to about 400 calendar years BP, and that was an uplift event. 1788, we had uplift as well. And then in 1964, we observed subsidence at Sitkinak Island. And here are the 3 islands. So here's Sitkinak, which we're looking at now, and we found the same 3 events at Siklitic and at Chirikop Island, right across the Samiti section and Kodiak section. Okay, so the conclusions then that we were able to draw from the studies at Sitkinak Island and also at Chirikop and Siklitic is our model is that when ruptures propagate through Sitkinak, so here's Sitkinak, and I drew these funny little blobs because I needed to expand on the schematic. So when the rupture propagates through Sitkinak Island, shown by the white dot, you get uplift at that island. Okay, so you have that zone of uplift close to the trench and the earthquake deformation cycle, and then coseismic subsidence a little further inland. So when the rupture propagates through the island, you get uplift. And that is true for 400 BP. So that allowed us to kind of extend this rupture boundary a little bit past Sitkinak Island. We don't have any evidence at Chirikop for 400 BP, so we just we didn't draw it any further, but we think it did go into the Samiti section a little bit. And another example of a rupture propagating through Sitkinak Island is 1788. So this is an earthquake that has been widely documented in eastern Kodiak Island and also in these 3 sites we looked at going further west. And again, it fits the model of a rupture propagating through Sitkinak Island here. There is some historical evidence of Shumagan Islands of 1788, but it's not confirmed. So we're not going to, this is kind of a big question mark out here, but we can at least draw it through a Chirikov for 1788 based on our geologic evidence. And then finally, we have the 1964 earthquake that is, we have widespread evidence for, and it suggests that it terminated basically at Sakanak Island. And for this, we have the model of the Sakanak Island here, rupture terminating at the island and the subsidence trough kind of wrapping around the island here and causing subsidence on the edge of a rupture. So our evidence suggests that this boundary is not persistent, that some earthquakes have propagated through. And so we wanted to kind of take the next steps then. So we have this knowledge of multi-section earthquakes are possible. So one thing that's going to happen is that our results will be incorporated into the next USGS seismic hazard maps, which is really great. And we can also use these results to inform our earthquake and tsunami modeling to learn more about potential impacts of future events. So this figure here shows the SAFR source. This is where the USGS modeled their tsunami to hit Southern California. And now we have the possibility of even bigger multi-section earthquake that can occur here. So these are shown by these NOAA unit sources that we used in our modeling that I'm going to describe now. So, oops. Okay, yeah. So first we wanted to use this coastal geologic knowledge to model these multi-section earthquakes. So basically that's what we did. We did a variety of earthquake modeling from magnitude 8 to magnitude 9.4 of earthquakes that were distributed all around these two sections. And we created this PDF of possible tsunami amplitudes at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So distant source tsunamis that propagate across the Pacific Ocean and hit the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And this is our possible amplitudes. However, because we know that tidal variability can have a big impact on tsunami heights, we incorporated this tidal PDF, probability density function of tides at the ports. And what that created was this red PDF of that dampened in some cases tsunami heights, and in some cases amplified them a little bit. So you just don't know when tsunami is going to strike the coast, and you need to consider the tidal variability there. So our maximum nearshore tsunami heights, which we called them because we modeled them at this tide gauge chute just offshore, are relative to mean sea level. So we decided to go with a datum that wasn't too extreme, so we could get a sense of, again, the tsunami might not strike at a very high tidal datum, which is what tsunami modeling often uses, but we wanted to sort of have a more conservative estimate of the possibilities at the ports. And so that was kind of the framework that we started with for our modeling at the ports. However, we also wanted to consider the future changes. Distant source tsunamis aren't incredibly common. So, it might be decades before you get a very significant one. And that time period, sea level might change. So we have these different RCP scenarios that we've all talked about. And then we hope to update now that we have some updated sea level projections from the new IPCC. But we use the 2.6, which is a more conservative estimate of these different sea level rise amounts by 2100, and worst case of 1.5 meters, which is quite a lot. And then the more aggressive, high emission scenarios where we don't do a lot to mitigate warming temperatures, and we have these sea level rise rates with the worst case of 2.5 meters. So we sampled these possible sea level projections, a range of sea level projections that might occur at the ports, to add this to our tsunami modeling to get a full picture of possible future maximum near shore tsunami heights at the ports. And so this is basically our tsunami heights that we got. The gray is equivalent to that red histogram. So that's in the year 2000 with no sea level rise included in our tsunami heights. And you can see that in these RCP 2.6, the lower emission scenarios, the maximum nearshore tsunami heights do not change significantly as you go forward in time. You have a small increase. If you use the higher emission scenarios, you can see that especially by 2070, 2100, you have a big jump in the possible maximum nearshore tsunami heights at the ports, because you're basically raising baseline sea level and allowing smaller tsunamis to have the same impacts. So another way to look at this that we thought about was the earthquake magnitude that has a 50-50 chance of exceeding a certain flood height as a function of time. So here we have time on the x-axis and the magnitude earthquake on the y-axis. And in this case, we've used tsunami heights of 1 meter, which is 2 times any historical event, that has occurred at the ports. You can see that today you need about a magnitude 9.1 to exceed 1 meter tsunami heights at the ports. But by 2080 and by 2100, under a high emission scenario, you only need a magnitude 8 to exceed that same flood height. And if we look at a little bit more extreme flood heights of 1.5 meters, so this is similar to SAFR, the USGS scenario, because they made their tsunami hit at mean high water, so their flooding was a bit higher, even though we had the same amplitudes. Happy to chat about that if anyone has questions. Today, you need a magnitude 9.4. In the future, though, you can see that, especially in a high emission scenario, you drop to magnitude 8.4 to get flood heights of 1.5 meters, which is quite a bit larger than anything that the ports have had in the observational period. So the big take-home messages here is that in the future, higher sea levels make the ports more vulnerable to tsunamis produced by less powerful earthquakes. Today, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake can produce maximum nearshore tsunami heights that exceed 3.2 feet or about a meter at the ports. But by 2100, under these high emission sea level rise projections, a much smaller magnitude 8 can produce a tsunami that exceeds 3.2 feet or about 1 meter. As we know, not all magnitude 8 earthquakes produce tsunamis, but some do. Our modeling shows that some do. They're small, but when you raise baseline sea level, then you let those smaller tsunamis have a bigger impact at the ports. All right, that's it. I'd like to thank my collaborators again, and I've added a few that were involved in the most recent study: Andrew Gardner, Robert Weiss, Ben Horton, and of course my USGS crew from Alaska. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tina Dura.
Anyone have questions, please?
Yeah, hey Tina, thanks for the talk. So earlier you said there is roughly a 13-year return period on magnitude 8 earthquakes in the region. And now you're also saying that a magnitude 8 is what it would take to seriously inundate LA Harbor, if I understand it correctly, in 2000, at the end of this century. So can LA expect to be facing, let's say, a 1 meter nearshore height from a tsunami, like every 13 years?
Well, not exactly. So, the relative occurrence of the earthquakes I mentioned was just to kind of give context for, how much more often how often an 8 occurs on the Alaska Aleutian Subduction Zone. However, of course, the Alaska Aleutian Subduction Zone is thousands of miles long, and they don't always occur just in the right spot that to create a tsunami that might affect Southern California. And also not every magnitude 8 can produce a small tsunami that, can make it all the way across the Pacific. So to answer your question, no. But, the modeling that we've done was really just to provide a starting point, a framework for this type of thing. And of course, a lot of other sources around the Pacific Rim that we could add to our modeling. And once you start adding more sources and more possible distant source tsunamis, then maybe you do start to see a return period where you could get something like that every decade, because distant source tsunamis are not all that uncommon. They're just really small in Southern California. But if you raise baseline sea levels, perhaps will become more of an issue.
Yes, Dr. Mohammed Muttu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tina. It was very great information which was provided, and I have lots of questions, but I think it's the right time now because of I mentioned we're trying to learn. But there is one thing which was very interesting for me to see maybe I misunderstood. That was about the segmentation, which you talked about it. That segmentation, are we talking about the different, the subduction zone had been divided to different segments? Let's say one subduction zone could be east and west, or east and central and west, something like this, or you're talking about the rupture zone of each individual kind of historical earthquake in that region. Is that which one are you referring to?
I was referring to the potential boundary to slip that was defined on hazard maps based on the historical rupture extents. So 1938 and 1964 did not overlap. So this area was treated as a potentially an area that might, stop slip and limit the magnitude of earthquakes in that area. And that's something that our paleoseismic studies have tried to address and look into, because as we know, when you start making assumptions like that, you can vastly underestimate what kind of earthquake can occur, such as in Japan, where it was thought that the magnitude of earthquake would be limited to less than 8, just based on the historical patterns of earthquakes. So yeah, I was referring to rupture patches that historically have not overlapped, and so have helped, were used to define earthquake hazard maps, and maybe wrongly used to define them.
Okay, that means, for example, in that Macron region, we have got some a few earthquake, historical earthquake, and when you plot the rupture area, now you found another way of looking at it, which I think might be very close to what you're saying. That therefore that also could be a basis for a kind of some other sort of understanding of the hazard map which been prepared in that area. Is that you will follow that, or will you support that?
Yeah, I think that historical earthquake observations and are very important to helping define hazards, but using this coastal geologic evidence to help go further back in time to see what other kinds of events you might expect is really important. So we've been able in Alaska to use both. So if you have both at your disposal, and one of them shows you some segmentation, but the geologic evidence shows you that there might be we like to call them sections and not segments so much, but multi-section earthquakes, then that's going to help make your hazards assessment more robust.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dura. Thank you. Now it is time to conclude the session. I request Dr. Sarah Woodruff, INCOA Coastal and Marine Processes Commission President, to give the concluding remarks. Dr. Sarah, please.
Hello, that was good timing. I was away and I came back at this perfect moment to say,
yes, perfect.
To say thank you everybody for coming. To Frango and his team have put together an awesome lineup of speakers for this meeting this afternoon and for yesterday as well. And I want to thank them for that, because I think it's a great start to the project. I don't want to say too much more because I know that you're running a little bit behind schedule. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming. There will be another, I'm sure Frango will tell you all about the next meeting in the series, which is going to happen next year. But hopefully it's been an enjoyable experience for everybody. I think hopefully everybody's learned something. You can see my little, my son is joining in here. He's come to say hello. So,
we thought somebody hackers came. Anyway.
Yeah, and I guess there's been a few Zoom related things that I guess we can learn from for next time. But just to say thank you for organising it. Thank you for everyone for coming. It's been really good. The speakers were awesome, and I'd like to hope to see you all again at the next Namilinks 2.0.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. It's a time to give the vote of thanks. Now I request Dr. Franco Johnson, leader Namilinks, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and participating. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to record my heartfelt thanks for Coastline Marine Process INQA for this project. Logistic support and guidance by Professor Sarah Woodruff, President, Coastline Marine Processes Commission, was great. I also thank our distinguished speakers, Professor Brian F. Atwater, Professor James Goff, Professor Maria Teresa Ramirez Herrera, Professor Pedro Costa, Professor Tina and Professor Michaela Spiske, and Professor Anjana Shaffers and Dr. Isabel Hong for their heavy cooperation for this program. Well, dear INQA committee members and ladies and gentlemen, such an event cannot happen overnight. It requires planning and bird eye for details. We have been fortunate enough to be supported by a team of very motivated and dedicated colleagues from reputed institutes, organizations who know their jobs. My deep sense of thanks and appreciation goes to all participants who have attended this webinar with great enthusiasm, made this event great success. In the end, thank you all for being with us. Have a wonderful day or night ahead. Thank you so much.